Have you ever felt a quiet, creeping fear? The kind that slides into your bones when the night stretches too long and the world outside your window seems a little too still? I hadn't. Not until the night they came knocking. That night, I discovered that there are some things in the dark. Things that look human but aren't. It started around midnight. The wind was whispering through the trees. A low, persistent moan that seemed to carry with it an unspoken warning. I was alone, curled up on my couch, with a book in my hand. The soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the world was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, a sound, faint at first, just a gentle tapping, barely loud enough to notice. But as it continued, it became impossible to ignore. It was coming from the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, spaced out, as though the knocker had all the time in the world. I set my book down and strained to listen. Who could be knocking at this hour? I wasn't expecting anyone, and my neighbors rarely visited, especially not this late. I got up slowly, every step towards the door feeling heavier, more reluctant. There was something off about the knocking. It wasn't frantic or impatient, the way you'd expect from someone in need. It was measured, almost calculated. I paused in front of the door, my hand hovering just above the knob. A part of me, a primal instinct, buried deep in my gut, was screaming not to open it. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and against my better judgment, I leaned forward and peeked through the peephole. 2 figures stood on my porch. They were tall, unnervingly so, with broad shoulders and straight, rigid postures. But it was their faces, or rather the lack of them, that made my blood run cold. The shadows seemed to cling to them, obscuring their features in a way that just didn't seem natural. I couldn't make out any details. No eyes, no mouth, just blank, featureless forms staring back at me through a peephole. I wanted to turn off all the lights, pretend I wasn't home, and hope they would leave. But before I could act, the knocking came again. Louder this time. 3 more slow, deliberate knocks. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my trembling hands. I knew I should call someone. The police, maybe, but something told me that wouldn't help. Whatever was standing on my porch wasn't human. Or at least, not entirely. Then, one of them spoke.
"Can we come in?"
The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was something about it that felt wrong. It was too smooth, too perfect, like a recording played on loop. The tone didn't match the situation, as if it didn't quite understand the context of the words it was using. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth was dry and my limbs felt like lead. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay silent, to not acknowledge them. But they knew I was there. Somehow they knew. "Please," the voice said again. "We need your help." It was a lie. I don't know how I knew, but I did. There was no desperation in their plea, no urgency, just a cold, detached calm that made my skin crawl. I backed away from the door, step by step, until I reached the living room, grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to dial for help. But as soon as I pressed the call button, the screen went dark. No dial tone, no signal, nothing. Just silence. Panic set in as I stared at my phone, willing it to work, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. I glanced back at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment, but the knocking had stopped. The only sound now was the wind howling outside and the faint rustle of leaves against the windows. I stayed silent like that for what felt like hours, huddled up on the couch, with the phone clutched in my hand, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the night stretched on, and slowly, the dread began to ebb away. When morning finally came, I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole once more. The figures were gone. My porch was empty, bathed in a soft light of dawn, but the memory of their presence lingered, a heavy, oppressive weight that I just couldn't shake. I thought it was over. I thought they were gone, but I was wrong. They'd only just begun. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept telling myself it was a one-time thing, a bad dream brought on by too many late nights and a vivid imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day passed in a haze. I went through the motions, showered, made coffee, tried to work, but my mind kept drifting back to the figures on my porch. Who or what were they? Why had they come to my house? Night fell again, as it always does, and with it came the anxiety. I triple-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, drew the curtains tight, and left every light in the house on. I even considered staying somewhere else, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. It felt safer to be in my own space, even if it was just an illusion of control. Around 11 p.m., I was sitting in the living room, the TV playing softly in the background. I was trying to distract myself, to convince myself that nothing would happen. But then, just as the clock struck midnight, the knock came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My heart sank into my stomach. I hadn't imagined it. They were back. I didn't move at first. I sat there, frozen, staring at the door as though it might open on its own. The knocking continued, patient and persistent. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. They knew I was here. I forced myself to stand. This time, I didn't go to the door. I didn't need to see them to know it was them. The same dread I'd felt the night before crept over me like a shadow, suffocating and inescapable.
Can we come in?
The voice again, soft, smooth, and utterly devoid of emotion. I backed away, clutching my phone like a lifeline. But just like the night before, when I tried to call for help, the screen went dark. No signal, no way to reach out. The knocks grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the wood groaning under the pressure, as if the door might give way at any moment.
Please?
The voice repeated. We need your help. But there was no urgency, no desperation. It was a performance, a mockery of human behavior. They were playing a game, and I was their unwilling participant. I retreated further into the house, heart racing, breath coming in shallow gasps. I needed to do something, anything. My mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. Then an idea struck me. I rushed to the back of the house, to the basement door. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. I could hide down there, lock the door behind me, and wait them out. Maybe they'd leave if they thought the house was empty. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was dimly lit, filled with old furniture and boxes I hadn't touched in years. I found a corner, out of sight from the stairs, and crouched there, listening. The knocking continued, a rhythmic, relentless sound that echoed through the house. But they hadn't tried to break in. Not yet. Minutes felt like hours as I huddled in the darkness, every sense on high alert. The silence was deafening, except for the occasional creak of the house settling. My breath fogged in the cold basement air, and I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to steady my nerves. Then I heard it. A new sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, but not from the front door. These were coming from above. From inside the house, they were already in. Panic surged through me. How? I'd locked everything, checked every door and window, but somehow they'd found a way in. I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling a cry. I couldn't let them hear me. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like the knocking. They moved from room to room, each creak of the floorboard sending a jolt of fear through me. They were searching, hunting for me. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but every option seemed to end the same way. I was trapped. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, makes your ears ring. I started to listen, every muscle tensed. Had they left? Were they waiting for me to make a move? Minutes passed, but it felt like an eternity. I stayed in my corner, too afraid to check. But then, from the top of the basement stairs, I heard it.
We know you're in there.
My blood turned to ice. They knew. Somehow they knew. I pressed myself against the cold concrete wall. The voice didn't sound angry or impatient. It was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a weight of certainty that crushed any hope I had left. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, and I knew there was no escaping now. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, they had found me, and I was at their mercy. The moment the voice spoke, everything inside me snapped. The blood in my veins turned to ice, and my limbs, still paralyzed with fear, became as heavy as lead. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I was trapped. The footsteps above me stopped. The silence of the house grew thick, almost suffocating. Time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity as I remained crouched in the corner of the basement, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like nails against the floor above me. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, slow, methodical, as if they were testing the house, searching for something or someone. I squeezed my eyes shut, my hand still pressed firmly over my mouth, trying to contain the terror that clawed at my throat. But it didn't help. The sounds continued, echoing down into the basement, filling the space with an unbearable tension. The scrape of something dragging across the floor, and then silence. Another scrape, this time closer, followed by the sound of something heavy, shifting in the darkness upstairs. They weren't just searching the house. They were moving through it methodically, like they were making sure I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream. I wanted to yell for help, to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. The weight of their presence pressed down on me. It felt as if the walls of the house were closing in, inch by inch, as if the very foundation was shifting under my feet. And then, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, not the basement door. No, the sound was coming from the upstairs hallway. Was it my bedroom door? The bathroom? I couldn't be sure, but I knew one thing for certain. The moment that door opened, they would know I wasn't where they thought I was. They would know I wasn't hiding upstairs like they had assumed. The silence of the house was broken again. This time, not by footsteps, but a faint whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable.
We see you.
The words sent a jolt through me. I didn't know what they were, but they had to be right above me, close enough to hear my every breath. The idea that they were so near, that they were so aware of my every move made my skin crawl. They weren't just looking for me. They knew exactly where I was. I could feel it. Then the whisper came again, but this time it was different. It was distorted, layered with unnatural, static-like buzz. The words were garbled, like a broken signal, but I could make out just enough to understand. Behind you. I froze. My eyes shot open. Behind me. But I had already checked. I had already scanned the dark corners of the basement, made sure nothing was lurking in the shadows. The stairs were behind me. The walls were bare. The basement was empty, except for me. But that voice, that whisper, it felt real. It felt close. I was trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the fear was feeding into my paranoia. But there was no denying the raw, unnatural sense of dread that filled the room. The oppressive weight of something just out of sight, lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. The scrape came again. The sound, still distant, but unmistakable. It was moving closer. I couldn't keep still anymore. I had to know. I had to see what was happening. Slowly, I lifted my head, careful not to make a sound, and I scanned through the basement, my eyes darting from one dark corner to the next. There was nothing, just the faint flickering light of the bulb above me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out, twisting unnaturally. And then I saw it. A shape. A distortion in the air, barely visible in the dim light, but it wasn't solid. Not quite. More like a ripple. A shimmer in the space itself. It moved almost imperceptibly, creeping along the far wall, near the old wooden beams. It wasn't a shadow, nor was it a person. It was something else entirely. Something that didn't belong. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But when I looked, it was gone. Vanished into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would reappear. I couldn't. I bolted up, stumbling towards the stairs. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs betrayed me. Trembling so violently I could barely take a step, I reached the bottom of the stairs and gripped the railing, pulling myself up. Step by step, my head was spinning, my breath ragged. The house was silent again, too silent. The voices had stopped, the footsteps had stopped, but I knew they were still here. They were watching, waiting. I reached the top of the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears. I glanced around the hallway. Everything looked as it should. The door to the bathroom was shut. My bedroom was slightly ajar. The house seemed empty, but it wasn't. I could feel it. My gaze flickered onto the living room, the kitchen, the dark corners of the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Everything seemed still, almost too still. I tried to shake the feeling. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but as I took a step forward, a soft sound caught my attention. A whisper, this time so faint, I thought I had imagined it.
Behind you.
I spun around, and no one was there. But then from the corner of my eye I saw it again. The shadow, the shape, that flicker in the air. It was moving, closer now, trailing me behind like a phantom. Its presence barely perceptible but unmistakable. I didn't wait any longer. I bolted towards the door, yanking it open and stumbling outside into the cold night air. The wind howled at me, but I didn't care. I was free from the house, but the question still hung in my mind. What was in there? And more importantly, why did it want me? I didn't stay outside for long. The night air was bitter, too cold for comfort, and the wind had a way of cutting right through my clothes. I didn't care. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. I couldn't go back to that house. Not after everything that happened. But where else could I go? I walked in circles around my yard. My thoughts were a tangled mess, my mind still racing with the echoes of the whispers, the scraping noises, the footsteps, the distorted voices. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that I was just exhausted, that everything would be fine if I just went back inside, locked the doors, and went to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, watching, waiting. I glanced toward the door of the house again. It stood dark and silent in the distance, as though nothing had happened, as though nothing was wrong. But I knew better. I couldn't fool myself. There was something in there, something I couldn't explain, and it wasn't done with me. My phone was still dead, no signal, no way to contact anyone. I couldn't even call for help if I wanted to. The isolation made it worse, the emptiness around me becoming a constant reminder of how alone I truly was. The darkness of the night seemed to press in from all sides. I couldn't even tell where the shadows ended and where the night began. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed whole. I looked down the driveway towards the street, trying to distract myself from the thoughts clawing at the back of my mind, but no car passed. No lights from a neighbor's house flickered in the distance. It was as if the entire neighborhood had vanished. I tried to shake off the unease, but I couldn't. Not anymore. I didn't know how long I'd been standing there, but eventually, I couldn't stay out in the cold any longer. I had to go back inside. I had to figure out what was going on. I walked back to the house, my every step heavy with dread, each one feeling like it might be my last. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, I knew deep down that it wasn't. Something wasn't right. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The house loomed ahead of me, dark and foreboding. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I had to face whatever was inside. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and stepped inside. The air felt different. Still, thick, with the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. I was back in the house, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt foreign, empty. I moved cautiously through the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. My eyes darted to the corners, searching for movement, for signs that I wasn't alone. But everything appeared normal. Too normal. The house was quiet, no signs of anyone moving. No strange shadows lurking in the corners, but I wasn't fooled. I headed for the living room, my mind still racing. I could almost hear their voices again. Faint echoes, like they were whispering from just beyond my hearing. The static buzz from before. But I couldn't be sure. The longer I stayed in this house, the more reality seemed to bend. My perception was fractured. Was this all in my head? Or was there something else at play here? When I reached the living room, my eyes fell on the door. The door that had been locked. I had checked it myself, locked it tightly, after the night of the knocks. But now, it was slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I hadn't opened that door. I hadn't touched it since I left earlier that night. I took a step closer. I felt the walls closing in again, the pressure mounting. I was going to have to confront this, whatever it was. The door creaked open on its own, as if it had been waiting for me. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind screaming at me to turn around and run, to get as far away from this house as I possibly could. But I couldn't. The door was open, and I had to know what was behind it. I took another slow step forward, until I was standing right at the threshold. Inside, the room was pitch black. The light was off. But it wasn't just dark. It was wrong. The darkness seemed to press in on me from every side, thick and suffocating. I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. I reached for the light switch, but before I could flick it, something made me pause. A feeling. A presence. Something was inside the room with me. I couldn't see it. I couldn't hear it. But I could feel it. And then I heard it. A soft, barely audible scraping sound. It came from the far corner of the room, just beyond my sight, like something or someone was moving. I stood there motionless. The scraping stopped, and in the silence that followed, the voice returned. Not a whisper, but a low hum. A sound that resonated in the air like a distant chant. The words weren't clear, but I could feel them.
We are coming.
The tone was unrecognizable, inhuman. Then came the sound of a door opening. Not the one I had just opened, but a new door, one I hadn't noticed before. A door behind me, at the far end of the hallway. I spun around, but there was no door there. I stood, rooted to the spot, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I knew what I had heard. I couldn't deny it, but there was no door. The hallway was empty. I turned back towards the living room, and the door had closed itself. The room, which had been pitch black a moment ago, was now dimly lit by the faintest glow, just enough to see the walls. But there was something new. The air felt thick with a scent of something metallic. I couldn't quite place it. Something was in the house. Something I couldn't see. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize, and it was close. I knew that whatever was happening, whatever was in this house, was not just trying to frighten me. It wasn't just a game. It wanted something. Something I couldn't understand, and I was its target. My legs trembled as I stood in the dimly lit room, the metallic scent growing stronger with each passing second. The light was faint, just enough to cast eerie shadows on the walls, twisting and curling like smoke. I didn't want to stay, but the weight of whatever was in this house seemed to press down on me, rooting me to the spot. I had to find out what was going on. Taking a cautious step forward, I scanned the room again, my eyes darting back to every dark corner, every shadow. I half expected to see something, someone, lurking, just beyond the edge of the light. But there was nothing. Only silence. The kind of silence that seemed to hum in your ears, filling the void where sound should be. I reached out to the light switch, my fingers trembling as they grazed the wall. The switch clicked under my touch, but the room stayed dim. The bulb above flickered weakly, casting brief stuttering flashes of light before dimming again. Something was wrong. It felt like the house itself was resisting my attempts to dispel the darkness. However, the faint hum I'd heard before grew louder, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the air. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around me, surrounding me. It was the same distorted voice, layered with that strange, static-like buzz. But now it wasn't whispering. It was chanting.
We are here. We are here. We are here. We are here.
The words repeated, over and over, growing louder and more insistent with each iteration. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it didn't help. It was inside my head, reverberating through my skull, making it impossible to think. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall behind me. As the chant grew to a deafening roar, the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe in response, their movements unnatural, chaotic. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will it all away, but the noise, the feeling of something pressing down on me, didn't stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting ceased. The silence that followed was so abrupt, so complete, that it was almost worse than the noise. I kept my eyes closed for a moment longer, afraid of what I might see if I opened them. But I couldn't stay like that forever. Slowly, hesitantly, I opened my eyes. The room was dark again, the faint glow from before completely gone. But the metallic scent was stronger now, almost choking. I felt my way along the wall, my fingers brushing against the rough surface, until I reached the doorway. I stepped out into the hallway, desperate to put some distance between myself and whatever was happening in that room. The house was quiet again, eerily so. I moved down to the hallway, each step hesitant, my breath shallow. The shadows seemed to stretch out in front of me, shifting and swaying as if alive. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet echoed through the house, amplified by the oppressive silence. I reached the kitchen, where a faint light from the moon streamed through the window, casting a silvery glow across the countertops. I leaned against the sink, trying to steady my breathing, trying to think. But the house wouldn't let me. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, as if 1,000 unseen eyes were tracking my every move. I turned towards the window, hoping for some comfort in the sight of the outside world. But what I saw made my heart stop. The reflection in the glass didn't match what was behind me. In the reflection, the hallway was filled with shadows, dense, writhing, unnatural shadows. They moved with a purpose, converging at the end of the hallway, just outside the door to the basement. And in the center of those shadows was a shape, a tall, indistinct figure, standing motionless, watching me. I spun around, expecting to see the figure in the flesh, but the hallway was empty. The door to the basement was shut. The shadows were gone, but the reflection didn't lie. I turned back to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was still there in the glass, still watching, still waiting. Its form was indistinct, almost a silhouette, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way it stood, unmoving, inhuman. It was like it wasn't constrained by the same rules that governed the rest of the world, like it was part of the shadows themselves. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. The house had changed. It wasn't just haunted. It was alive, filled with something dark and ancient, something that didn't belong. The metallic scent filled my nostrils again, stronger than ever, and I realized it was coming from the basement. Whatever was in the house, Whatever was watching me, it was down there. I didn't want to go back to the basement, but I knew I had no choice. I wanted to understand what was happening. If I wanted to stop it, I had to face it. Taking a deep breath, I made my way back to the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The door to the basement loomed ahead, its surface warped and twisted in the dim light. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into my skin. As I opened the door, a rush of cold air hit me, carrying with it the scent of something ancient, something decayed. The stairs stretched down into the darkness. The basement below was hidden from view. I could hear the faint hum again, the distant whisper of voices, echoing up from the depths. I took the first step down, the wood creaking under my weight, then another, and then another. The darkness swallowed me whole, the basement seeming to close in around me as I descended. Each step felt like I was being drawn further into a place I didn't belong, a place that was waiting for me. Whatever is down here, it's waiting. The descent into the basement felt endless, the air growing colder with each step I took. My hand gripped the railing tightly, my knuckles white with tension. The hum that had been a faint whisper before now filled the space around me, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very air. It was no longer a distant echo. It was here. It was alive. When I finally reached the bottom, the darkness was absolute. The faint light from above barely touched the basement floor, leaving everything in a thick, impenetrable shadow. I could feel the presence now, stronger than ever, surrounding me, pressing against my skin. I fumbled for the light switch on the wall, my fingers brushing over the cold, rough surface. Click. The bulb overhead flickered once, then again, before casting a dim, sickly yellow glow across the basement. The room was exactly as I'd left it. The old shelves lined with forgotten boxes, the furnace humming quietly in the corner, the concrete floor cracked and worn. But it felt different now. The room was the same, but the air was heavy, thick with a feeling of something unseen. I stepped further into the room. The hum grew louder, resonating from the far corner of the basement, where the shadows seemed to gather and pulse. I moved towards it, each step slow and deliberate, my eyes locked on the darkness that seemed to shift and swirl as I approached. As I got closer, I saw it. A door. It hadn't been there before. The wall that had always been solid now held an old wooden door, its surface worn and splintered, as if it had been there for centuries. The door was slightly ajar, the faintest crack of darkness visible between its frame. From within, the hum emanated, deep and resonant, pulling me closer. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. I had to understand what had taken over my home. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. Beyond the threshold was a room unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were lined with an old, crumbling stone, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. The air was cold, much colder than the rest of the basement, and the metallic scent was overpowering now, making my eyes water. At the center of the room stood a figure. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, its limbs elongated and distorted, its form shrouded in shadow. Its skin, if it could even be called that, was pale and stretched over a skeletal frame. Its eyes, sunken and empty, glowed faintly with an unnatural light. It didn't move, it didn't speak, it just stood there, watching me. I tried to step back, but my legs refused to move. I was frozen in place, locked in the gaze of the creature before me. I asked, "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate, as if it was studying me, as if deciding what to do next. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my body, filling my mind with a static-like buzz that drowned out all other thought. And then, it spoke.
"We have been watching, waiting. You are the key."
Its voice was a cacophony of sounds, layered and distorted, each word echoing and overlapping, creating a symphony of terror that seemed to vibrate through the room. I couldn't comprehend what it was saying, couldn't grasp the meaning of the words. All I knew that whatever it was, it had been here for a long time, waiting in the shadows. Why me? What do you want from me? The figure stepped forwards, its movements fluid and unnatural. With each step it took, the room seemed to warp around it, the shadows bending and twisting in its wake. It raised one long skeletal hand and pointed at me.
"You opened the door. You let us in."
I shook my head, backing away as the realization dawned on me. The knocking at the door, the voices, the whispers, it had all been a trap, a lure to draw me into their grasp. I had let them in, unknowingly invited them into my home, into my life. No, I didn't mean to. The figure tilted its head again, the glow in its eyes intensifying. It was no longer just watching. It was feeding off of my fear, growing stronger with every passing second. I had to get out. I turned and ran, bolting up the stairs as fast as my legs could carry me. The hum followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as if the house itself was alive, breathing down my neck. I reached the top of the stairs and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, as if that could keep whatever was down there from following me. The house was still, silent, but I knew it wasn't over. I grabbed my keys from the counter and ran out the front door, not bothering to shut it behind me. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I was at the end of the street, the house barely visible in the distance. I turned back, my breath fogging in the cold air, and watched. The house stood dark and silent, as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I could feel the presence even from there. The house was no longer mine. It belonged to them now. They're still in there, waiting, watching, and I don't think they'll ever leave. I turned away, the cold seeping into my bones, and started walking, not knowing where I was going, only that I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to them.